With our introductions.
Yeah, I'm happy to welcome everybody to our June Lunch and Learn over Zoom about sexuality and dementia today. Thank you all for joining us. We will, like Holly mentioned, receive a post email this afternoon with a copy of the slides, a copy of the recording for today. And we welcome you to share these resources with anybody that you think would benefit or maybe couldn't make it today. But there's also going to be a link to an evaluation. We do ask that everybody fill out the evaluation. Your feedback is important to us, but it is required if you want CE credits. So we are offering 1 hour of CE credits for nursing, social work, and LPCs. And that will be once you complete that evaluation, then you will receive a CE certificate for your time. I also want to invite you all, of course, to our support groups that we do twice a week. We have one this afternoon at 1 o'clock and then one on Friday at 11 a.m. Yeah, then those are every week. And then we have a second Saturday support group. It's the second Saturday of the month and it's at 10:30. And Holly facilitates all of these support groups and they're wonderful. I sit in on as many as I can, and I learn something new and just encouraged every time I sit in on those. And they are open to the public. So please feel free to join at any time that you can. We also have a Alzheimer's and Dementia Family Care Partner training that's going to start next Thursday. And this is a 6-session training, and it really covers what to expect, all aspects of communication, managing the day-to-day of caregiving, planning for the future, and how to care for yourself. So we're going to do it every Thursday from 11 to 12 for 6 weeks in a row, starting next Thursday. And I will make sure that you get that information in the follow-up email this afternoon as well. And a few other upcoming programs that we have in June that you get that information and how to register. That way you can put it on your calendar and hope we see you there. And I think I've covered just about everything. So turn it over to you, Holly.
Thanks, Jamie. The only other thing I would mention is that June is Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. And so if you go on our website and if you get our emails, you've already got this, we're doing something every day this month for Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. Also, if you'll check out our social media, our Facebook, LinkedIn, we're posting Tuesday tips and tricks, just different things that you can do for your loved one that has dementia, just little short ideas. And sometimes it's stuff that you know, but you're going, oh, I hadn't thought about that in a while. So check that out. And then all of it is kind of leading up to those of you who work closely with the Alzheimer's Association. The longest day is June 20th. And so here at the West Center, we're going to be doing what we call Rockin' for a Cure, where we'll be rocking and rocking chairs all day and raising money for the Alzheimer's Association. And this year I got smart and I'm moving it inside, because I've always sat outside in the heat to do it, but it's going to be an inside rocking chair this time. So we do appreciate you being here. We will get started. I'm going to share my screen. And like Jamie said, you will get a copy not only of the slides, but also of the recording. So let me get this started. Is that good, Jamie? You can see it? Perfect. All right, so here's my information for those of you that are getting your CEs. Sometimes they'll ask you for this type thing. So I'm a licensed professional counselor. I taught school for the first 20 years of my career, but then I went back and got my master's degree in counseling and specialized in narrative therapy and in end of life. So I've been working in memory care for many years now. And this topic, whenever we do sexuality and dementia, or we do Hospice 101. That's two of the topics that so many times people don't want to talk about, but we have a really good turnout when we do these programs. In fact, I think it's programs that we could probably do quarterly and we'd have a lot of folks come on. So here's our objectives today. And we're going to talk about what is considered an inappropriate sexual behavior, some misconceptions about sexuality, ways to respond to sexual behaviors. We're going to talk about Texas resident rights for sexuality and intimacy, and then we're going to talk about ways to remain intimate with a loved one that has dementia. So as we get started, I found this, I update this every time that I do this program. And I was looking yesterday, there's also going to be a lot of resources at the end. So second to last slide, I'm going to give you an entire slide full of resources. But this yesterday, I found on the Family Caregiver Alliance site, and it talked about that the subject of intimacy is one of those subjects that rarely comes up when we're talking to professionals, whether we're talking to a physician, we're talking to social workers, we don't talk about it. It's like the idea of sexuality in the elderly or in the sick is taboo, that it's something that we don't want to think about, we don't want to talk about. But we're all sexual beings. We all are. And so it's normal and it is okay to have needs and to have feelings. So before we even really dive into this, please hear that before we go any further. None of this is anything to feel guilty about. None of this is anything to feel shame about. And we're going to talk about some difficult stuff. We're going to talk about some things that, you may have even thought, am I the only person that's having these thoughts? Am I the only person that's reacting this way? I guarantee you that you're not. And I've heard, I try to say I've heard it all. I hadn't heard it all, but I've had a lot of these conversations with families, and I'm going to share some of those with you. Meeting with adult children, so many times they do not understand, why is my parent who's losing their spouse grieving in a different way than I'm grieving? Or why are they reacting in a different way than I'm reacting? Because it's their spouse and not their parent. So think about this for just a minute. As much as we don't like to think about it, we know that we're likely going to bury our parents. That's kind of the order of things. We're going to lose our parents. But none of us, when we got married or entered into a long-term relationship, went into that thinking, I'm going to lose this person. I'm going to lose this person that I am madly in love with, who lights me up, who gives me butterflies. We don't go into that relationship thinking that they may someday develop a disease that's going to take them away from us little by little, and that we're going to be their care partner, and that we may end up having to take care of them in the bathroom, help them shower, brush their teeth, assist them at mealtime. So the grief that a spouse feels for a spouse is very different than the grief that an adult child feels for a parent. I've had to sit with a lot of adult children before and say, let's just bring it down to this. What if it was your spouse that got the diagnosis of a dementia? You'd feel a different way if it were your spouse than if it were your parent. And most of the time, they say, well, that's different. Yeah, it is different. It is different. And it's also hard for us to think of our parents as sexual beings. Most of us at that time want to go, oh, la, 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 la. I don't want to think about that. But they are, and they were, and they have been. So to those of you that are adult children or who work with adult children, I think kind of pushing through that to begin with and help adult children recognize the difference in what the spouse is feeling is huge to push through, and making sure that everybody knows it's okay to talk about this. This is not taboo. That's why we're talking about it. So as this disease progresses, a lot of things are happening, and they may not be able to perform. You may not be interested anymore. And we're going to kind of deep dive into those things as to why is that happening. And what you do together sexually is going to change as the disease progresses. And it's very common, especially earlier in the disease, for both people to have feelings of guilt, anger, rejection, shame, because of changing sexual feelings that are going on, and maybe not being able to talk about it, or not feeling like you have anyone to talk to about it. But all of the things that are happening with your loved one and with yourself sexually, that it's not anything that you can take personally. It's not a rejection. It's something that is going on. They are having brain atrophy. They are having chemical changes in their brains. And some of the things that they're going to do and say, they don't have control over. We have to accommodate the disease. They can't. It's very normal to feel rejected. It's normal to feel very lonely during this time. And so we've got to find people we can talk to that we trust. But again, this is a topic that's hard to talk about for so many people. So let's look at kind of coping with the changes that are going on. Now, keep in mind when we're talking about sexuality, of course, we're not just talking about intercourse, we're talking about intimacy. We're talking about that connection that is special, that is only shared between partners. This isn't a one-night stand. This is somebody that you've been together with 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 plus years. I met with a family, and the husband and wife have been married 71 years. That man and woman had only ever been together. They'd been together since they were kids. They had only shared that part of their lives with each other. No one else could understand. As much as the kids wanted to, unless you've walked that path, you couldn't truly stand in their shoes. That was their person. That was their sweetheart, their honey, their sugar, their sweetie. And these changes were something that they weren't prepared for. But when we're talking about sexuality, think about what all that is. It's our way that we're connected to this other person. It's a way that we're very close to them. And sometimes when nothing else is going right in our relationship, now think of these long-term relationships, 50 plus years. We've had those highs and lows in our relationships, but many times we can come back to the intimacy remains. The intimacy stays. It's that something that feels comfortable in the relationship, even when nothing else is going right. We can come back to the two of us. And it's been there for a very long time. And it's something that makes us feel good. And it's something that's pleasurable. And it goes away and it changes. So when something goes away, let's call it, what do? We grieve it. Even though most of the time we don't use the word grief because we tend to relate grief to death. And it's a change in our relationship. And so we grieve it. Taking care of somebody with dementia is stressful. There's no doubt about that. And so losing that part of the relationship is stressful. But we're going to talk about and hopefully find some ways for you to focus on the pleasurable aspects of your relationship. So dementia is full of losses. We don't want to focus on those losses, but dementia has a lot of losses. And again, earlier in the disease, that person who has dementia is very aware that something's not quite right. And we can really see them start to suffer from a loss of self-esteem. They're afraid. Even if it doesn't look like they're afraid, they're afraid. This disease is filled with fear, not only for the person who has the diagnosis, but for the people who love them, because we can really get caught up on the what ifs. Where is this headed? They know something's wrong. So they may be worried, they may be depressed, they may be angry, because in a lot of people, we're going to resort back to that easiest emotion, and the easiest emotion is anger. So it may come out as anger, but at the root of anger, most of the time, it's fear about something. Now you, as the caregiver, may start to pull away. You may start to pull away emotionally and physically, because your roles are switching and you're becoming that care partner, that caregiver. And you may be having to work through a lot of frustration because you're learning about this disease and they're forgetful. They're repeating things all the time. They're doing behaviors that are making you crazy. And the last thing you want to do is be physically intimate with them. But you want them to still be that person to hold you and make everything right. And maybe they can't anymore. So all of these changes, again, are very, very normal. They are difficult to deal with, but they're very normal. On that very last bullet point there, I have put, because we hear guilt an awful lot when people talk about this, having fewer sexual feelings toward their partner, and they'll start to feel guilty about that. It is okay to have conflicting feelings. So here's some facts as we kind of head into this. And I've already said, sexuality is a continuing human need. It's common to all people. Don't think at all that this is something that you're just going through. And also, another fact is that as we change, we have little change in our interest in sex and intimacy. Maybe we don't want it as often. Maybe we're not as creative as we were at one time, but the interest is still there. Intimacy is still there. We still long for that. A person with dementia may not be able to express their sexual needs or may express them in socially inappropriate ways. And we're going to talk about some specifics with that. And it is okay for you and your loved one to be sexually close in any way that you are both comfortable. So we're going to look at what does that mean and what does consent look like. So again, because a person has a diagnosis of dementia does not mean that they stop being a sexual person. But then, as the partner of that person with dementia, we may feel guilty. We may feel like we're taken advantage of. We may feel not interested. We may have a lot of feelings that we're not used to having. But these are some things we need to remember about consent. Because someone is physically aroused, that does not mean they're consenting. Physical arousal alone is not consent. Keeping in mind also that a person with dementia may be very unaware of your needs. And so it may be you that's not consenting. They are aroused, you're not interested, but they can't pick up on that you're not consenting because they can only think about what's going on with them. Nobody should ever be forced into any type of a sexual or intimate activity that they're not comfortable with. And as their partner, you should feel confident that you can recognize, because you've been with them the longest, you know them, you can recognize nonverbal consent before you start any type of sexual activity. And you should never initiate sexual activity without clear consent. And you must stop at any sign of reluctance. All of this information, alzheimers.org. And again, this is going to be on the resource page at the end. There's a lot of information on what does consent look like. Now, this is consent between two long-term partners. We'll also talk about consent after somebody is placed, because sometimes a person is placed in a nursing facility or another type of assisted living, something along those lines, and they may start a relationship with somebody there. So what does consent look like there? So we'll talk about that too. Let's go into misconceptions that increase caregiver stress. So we've talked about that misconception of that the elderly have no interest in sex. That's not true. Women are unable to have orgasms after menopause. That's not true. The idea of sexuality in the aged is shameful and perverse. Again, these are all myths. These are things that are not true. Frail old people will get hurt having sex. Caregivers' needs or distress are signs of selfishness or incompetence. and all caregiver energy and effort must go to the patient. These are all myths. These are misconceptions. These are things that are not true. A caregiver should be able to assume all required tasks and responsibilities. Well, we say all the time, I can do anything, but I can't do everything. I can take on an awful lot. Can't do everything. Another myth, it is not okay to have sex with someone with dementia. That's a misconception. The person with dementia is a stranger. No, they're not a stranger. They are still there. They will always be there. Their amygdala is going to stay intact all the way to the end of this disease. Even if they have a flat affect and it looks like they're not there, they are there. The person with dementia seems to forget that the partner is there or how to make love. So sometimes the spirit is willing, but we've got some other issues going on. Health-related factors. So some things that can interfere with intimacy. Diabetes is right up there at the top of the list. Hypertension, a person who's very depressed, a hormone imbalance, prostate issues, all of these things can affect sexual desire. And again, this is where, as a partner, we can't take those type things personally if we have this going on as well. Some other ones, heart disease, osteoporosis, arthritis, incontinence, emphysema, all of these can affect ability and enjoyment. Side effects of medications. As you're researching sexuality and dementia, or sexuality in people over 65, this comes up over and over, the fear of a heart attack or stroke during intimacy. It rarely happens, but there's fear of it. And sex may not be as gratifying or as frequent, and it may be awkward. So sometimes people will kind of back away from it. So let's talk about some inappropriate sexual behaviors in those with dementia. And I was able to find some percentages, or how often do we see this? Because you may have a loved one you're going, oh, how often does that happen? Is this something that is going to happen? Is this something that might happen? Is that normal for them to do? Keep in mind what's going on with them. As we're talking about this, think about what's happening in the brain of someone with dementia. Any type of dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's, Lewy body, FTD, any type of dementia, Parkinson's, their brain is beginning to atrophy. Their brain is shrinking. Their brain cells are dying. Their chemical changes are happening. It's not something they can control. If they could control it, they would. Inappropriate sexual behaviors are more common in people that have FTD, frontotemporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia than the other dementias. Keeping in mind there's over 100, close to 130-ish dementias. They can show up in any of the dementias. So let's look at the most common that we see. 85% of people with dementia at some time or another will touch, hug, or kiss strangers. That's very common. We see that a lot because they will forget kind of that social, my social space here, and will just go. I've had some of the best kisses. And if I'm not careful, a lot of them are right on the mouth. Kissing, hugging, touching, just going up to strangers and doing that. So about 85% of the time, people with dementia will do that. So that's pretty high. And then 50% of the time, at some point during the disease, they'll undress. They'll take their clothes off in a public place. Now, please don't think to yourself right now. I know some of you are thinking, oh, my mama would never do that. Oh, don't say that. Because dementia will do that. I had a son-in-law come into my office one time and he was holding his head and said, I just saw more of my mother-in-law than I ever wanted to see. Because he'd gone in and she had all of her clothes off. Well, that wasn't sexual. What was going on with her wasn't sexual. There's lots of reasons a person might take their clothes off. And we're going to talk about those, but think about it. They're hot. There's a tag. This doesn't feel right. Something's bothering me. Their brain's beginning to atrophy. They can't reason out, well, I'll just go adjust the thermostat, so they take their clothes off. The next one, 40% of the time, people may be aggressive or have repeated sexual overtures. 25% of the time, exposing oneself during personal care tasks, and think about why that might happen. We're going to talk about that. Why would somebody do that during an ADL time, activities of daily living? 16% of the time, someone may masturbate in public. 7% of the time, using sexually laden language, and then suggestive behavior or language. And along the lines of language, let me just remind everybody, we've got those two different areas in our brain of language. We've got language on the left and language on the right. The language on the left is that day-to-day language. The left language leaves. That's this kind of talk. That's banter. But the language on the right rhythmic remains. That's why music stays, prayer many times stays, poetry stays, but sexual language, curse words, racial slurs also store on the right. They store on the right because they're not our day-to-day language. Once upon a time when we heard those words, somebody said, I better never hear you say that again. So we didn't store it over on the left in our day-to-day, we stored it on the right and it stays. So sometimes people who have never used sexual language will start to use sexual language because that's what's left. It doesn't have anything to do with sex. It's just the language that's left. So how do we respond when somebody is doing something that we consider an unacceptable behavior? We're most definitely not going to scold or shame or ridicule them. They aren't children. We're not going to react in that way. What triggered the behavior? This is like with all dementia behaviors. It is a type of communication. They're trying to tell us something. Let's step back and look in and go, what triggered that? What happened right before? What happened right afterwards? I used to have a gentleman who, whenever I had students who would come in, and I would tell the students ahead of time not to do a front hug with him, to only do a side hug. Because if he did a front hug with anybody, he was going to run his hands up and down their chest. It's what he did. Was that a sexual behavior? Was it an unacceptable behavior? But it was something that we figured out. Why does he do it? When does he do it? You do a side hug, he doesn't do it. You do a front hug, he takes full advantage of that. Some of these behaviors we can ignore. There's a lot of them that we can't ignore. We want to encourage acceptable behaviors and we want to praise those. You may end up having to sleep apart from your loved one, and usually that's temporary. We want to learn and become masters of redirection and how to delay, put it off for a little bit. If they keep bringing it up, keep bringing it up, keep bringing it up. A person with dementia has a one-track mind. So if we can get them moved over to something else, and the 4 best things to use, number 1, food, the sweeter the better. And that may sound silly. They're trying to get very, very sexual. They're becoming aggressive sexually. I've got that homemade ice cream and if we can just put it off for a little bit, if we can get their mind, time doesn't mean the same thing to a person with dementia because of where time is stored. So 20 minutes could be 2 hours. 2 hours could be 20 minutes. Doesn't mean the same. Another distraction, music, their music. And if you can get music and sweets together, animals and children, and this doesn't have to be real animals or real children. This can be videos, children laughing, baby animals, use YouTube. Sometimes medications do have to be used temporarily, and we're going to talk specifically about medications. And sometimes we may have to stop unsupervised visits with children or with vulnerable adults if there's a safety issue. Other ways that we can respond is use touch in everyday routines. Okay, so where's this coming from? This is what's called compassionate touch. We tend to, as the disease progresses, stop touching them except for task. And a person's not a task. And a person needs to be touched. You may have heard touch deprivation is a big term right now. Touch deprivation, because we've been in lockdown for a year and people weren't being touched. It wasn't sexual. It was just people needing to have touch with another person. So make sure and use touch in everyday routines, whether it's just reaching over and placing our hand on them or rubbing their shoulders or putting lotion on them, because people crave touch and that can come out as they're being sexual. There's the distraction and redirection again. Using that validation therapy, and validation therapy is saying back to someone that you understand. It's empathy. It's not sympathy, it's empathy. Not overreacting or expressing shock. And this is huge. Don't try to reason or be rational. You cannot be reasonable or rational with someone who cannot be reasonable or rational. That's stored up here in the front part of the brain. This is why, especially with that FTD, frontotemporal dementias, we'll see more of these behaviors. It's gone. That part of the brain is gone. They can't be reasonable or rational, or they would. We've got to be sensitive and reassuring, and then redirect to a private area if they're doing something that's in public. Sometimes if we can get them off to a private area. So let's think about if something actually is sexual. So we look at several things. What could be going on? Let's think about the time of day that this is happening. They may start taking their clothes off because they think it's time to get ready for bed. Time doesn't mean the same thing. If it's a really cloudy day and it's dark outside, dark means sleep, dark means bed, and they may start taking their clothes off. It's not sexual, getting ready for bed. A person who has dementia, like I said earlier, if they've got a tag bothering them, if their bra strap's twisted, if something's too tight or it's itchy, they'll take it off rather than say, could you help me with this tag back here? It's kind of itching me, because they don't have the ability to say that. They may need to go to the bathroom and start taking their clothes off. Or they may go to the bathroom and walk out of the bathroom with no clothes on. They may be fondling themselves, and it isn't sexual. They're just fondling themselves. Getting in bed with another resident. This is something that happens a lot, and families many times don't understand. They'll say things like, I've had families say to me, oh my God, I can't believe my mother went and got in bed with a strange man. She was married to my dad for 50 years. Exactly. She was married to your dad for 50 years, and she went to bed beside a man for 50 years. And she went and found a man to get in bed with, and it wasn't anything sexual. She wanted to be held. She wanted to be in bed with another person. It wasn't sexual. A person can misinterpret cues. This happens a lot during that ADL time, that activities of daily living. We're getting ready to actually get them dressed or undressed or in the shower or to the toilet, and they mistake it as something sexual. Because who have they ever been around that helped take their clothes off? Maybe a doctor, maybe their parent a long, long time ago. And when they were about to have sexual activity with a spouse. And here we are, either as a professional caregiver or as a family caregiver. I had an adult son come to me one time, tears running down his face because he was helping his mom get dressed. And she started, as he put it, coming on to me. She was coming on to me. So what were you doing at the time? I was helping her get dressed. I said, okay, let's think about in her mind. First of all, do you look like your daddy? And he said, I look just like my daddy. I'm spitting image of him. Okay, you look like your daddy. And you were helping her take her clothes off. Where did her mind go? She wasn't seeing you as her son. Because in her mind right now, she's not a mom, she's a wife. Step back and think about where she is. Empathy. There's that ADL time, activities of daily living, where they confuse what's happening. And another thing, they may just be expressing that need for affection or touch. Now, sometimes people with dementia can become hypersexual. It does happen, where they are overly interested in sex. And they may masturbate right out in the public in front of others. They may call people to come near them and then expose themselves. So some of the things that we can do, many times it is attention seeking, where they need more attention, they need more reassurance. This is something that they can control. So we try to use other types of affection to meet those needs, using lots of non-sexual touch, because again, so many times it is, let me get you to pay attention to me type things. If this is happening at home, we can do some things as sharing those intimate moments that don't even require touching. One of the things that partners can do is that they can reminisce. We can go back and talk about things from our past together. We can have a date, a meal, or a movie, and we can hold hands, and it can be very intimate without it being sexual. And occasionally, this is where, when somebody does become hypersexual, where we have to temporarily use a medication until they get past this phase, and it is a phase. All dementia behaviors, they are all phases. They will end when we're in the middle of them, and especially ones like this, if they become hypersexual, it can feel like this is never going to end. Oh my goodness, when is this going to stop? But I promise it does. They turn the corner. As the disease progresses, they turn the corner. Now keep in mind some other things that are going on with dementia. They lose awareness of themselves. Just like I said earlier, they lose awareness of others. They lose social skills. They don't understand the consequences of their actions, and they don't understand how their actions impact other people. I had a client who he was a very early onset. He was in his early 50s, and he became hypersexual. And the wife came and she said, it's all he wants to do. And at first I kind of went along with it because he still wanted me. And it seemed to calm him down. But now it feels like I'm being used. It's all he wants to do. And we had to talk through, why was that? Why was that happening with him? And what was it doing to her? It was hard for her to talk about. That kind of thing happens, where she longed to have her husband, wanting her and desiring her. But it got to the point that it felt like there was no emotion there. Like I said, they'll lose those social skills where they can kind of read what you're feeling. They lose the ability to be able to do that. So some other ways that we can remain intimate, that we can still have touch, that we can still bond and connect. And again, it's important to have touch that isn't necessarily sexual, like putting lotion on, so that we don't get into that touch deprivation. Combing somebody's hair, brushing their hair, doing their nails. Dancing is huge. People who have dementia, many times, people who've never ever danced before will dance because that right rhythmic side remains. I wish I had $1 for every time I'd had someone say to me, I can't believe my dad's dancing. He's a Baptist. My dad doesn't dance. Well, dementia dances, or dementia sways, or dementia. That's self-soothing also to rock. So sometimes to have someone and hold them and rock. Doing exercises together, those range of motion type exercises, assisting them at mealtime, using that touch, bathing or showering together, using massage, snuggling, cuddling, hugging, holding hands, still verbally telling them that you love them, continuing to connect as a husband, a wife, a partner. I love you. Look them in the face and tell them that you love them. That's part of assuring them that they're safe, telling them that they're not going to be alone. Part of the gentleman that I was talking about earlier who had become hypersexual, part of what was happening was that was a way of him to have control and to keep her right there. Because if she was there, he was safe. And we're together doing this, then I'm okay. And you're right here, so I'm safe. Got to think about how their mind's working. And of course, again, as long as it is okay for both, you can continue to kiss, to touch, to have intercourse, to do whatever both of you are consenting to do. Sitting side by side. A lot of people will put their chairs to where they touch, so they're side by side so they can sit and just reach over and have their hand on their loved one while they're watching TV, while they're sitting together, again, because they crave touch. Think about what we do with a small child when they are in any type of distress. We scoop them up, we hold, we rock, we touch, we pat. But we stop doing that with people with dementia when they need it most. As the disease is progressing, we need to touch. So part of that guilt that will come with spouses is they will have but I took a vow, till death do us part. But my loved one's still alive, but I feel single because I've placed my loved one, or he's not comfortable, or it's not appropriate, or I feel like a single person, but my loved one's still alive. It's called being in social limbo. I'm a single spouse, is how some people will word it. Being able to share with other spouses that are in the same situation will help you so much. So finding support groups. There are support groups that are specific to spouses, but just coming on and listening to other people in the same situation and how they worked through, and not being afraid to bring the subject up. Like we said, this isn't taboo. There's people that you can talk to. Many times, though, you do have to bring it up, because typically the doctor, the social worker, the counselor, the clergy is not going to just automatically ask you, so as far as your intimate relationship with your loved one, how's that? That's probably not going to come up, like we said. You need somebody who can just be safe, who will hear you. They may not have any answers for you, but if you're the spouse, if you're the partner, and you're not comfortable talking to your adult children about this, you need someone who can hear you, because this is grief. It is grief. We're grieving the loss of that part of our relationship. Now, people will say, no, Holly, we hadn't been intimate in years. We had not had intercourse in years, is what they're saying. You've been intimate. Yes, you have been intimate. You were being intimate in other ways. Maybe you already were sleeping in separate bedrooms, but you still had those special things between the two of you. You had those special looks. You had those special touches. You had those special words. and they go away. So you're grieving the loss of that intimate relationship. There's that term I used earlier about being a single spouse. So more guilt that comes to caregivers of those with dementia. Many times they'll the person who doesn't have dementia will feel guilty if they do initiate sex with their spouse. They'll feel like they're taking advantage of them, and that's where we talked about consent. They'll also feel guilty and they'll feel selfish if they choose to either masturbate or if they choose to pursue an intimate relationship outside of the marriage. And that does happen. Many people will start to seek companionship outside of their relationship. That's where you answer to you answer to your spouse, you don't answer to too many other people. I've got a great movie I'm going to recommend for you at the end. We actually did a viewing of it here, and it addresses a lot of these. Olympia Dukakis is in it. And it talks about those changing roles, relationships. And caregivers also admit, I mentioned this earlier with the client that I had, to using sex to calm their spouses down. But then the sex doesn't have any emotion or passion. It leaves them feeling degraded or used because they feel like they used it to help calm down their loved one. So this is a copy of the Texas Health and Human Services System residents' rights as far as sexuality and intimacy are concerned. So residents, this is people who are placed in a long-term care, assisted living, that type. Residents are entitled to express themselves sexually as long as the expression, so this is a person's rights, is not a public display. And that's where if somebody were masturbating in a living room area, we're going to get them over to a bedroom area because they have the right to do that, but we need to do it in the bedroom and not the living room. Is consensual. Okay, so let's look at what this is. This is a talk I've had to have many, many times. Must have the mental capacity to make the decision and be on the same cognitive level between residents. So in a place where all of the residents are together, all of the different levels are together, it is not appropriate for a very, very high functioning resident to have sexual relations with someone who is at a lower, more advanced stage in the disease because they can't consent the same. But people who are on the same level of the disease that can both consent have the right to have a consensual relationship. And usually 9 times out of 10, it is companionship. They may want to lay in the bed together. They may want to kiss. They may want to touch. It is usually companionship that they are looking for. This is really, really hard to watch if that's your spouse doing that with someone else. Or if it's your parent doing it with someone that's not your mama or your daddy. This again, these resources I'm going to give you on the next slide. I've got some great resources to help you with that. And if it does not harm the resident or others. Now, the staff members' responsibilities. We've got to have policies and procedures to take into consideration the residents' rights. We've got to protect the residents from harm, all residents, document observations of sexual expression. We report that information regarding the resident's sexual expression to family members. That is required. Again, that's why I've had a lot of those talks. And then we provide the resident with privacy. Now, same thing, if a loved one is placed and their spouse comes and wants to be alone with them, they have the right to do that as long as consent can happen and nobody is being harmed, nobody is being hurt. Here's that page I was telling you about as far as the resources go. And I've put names of some books and authors. You can get each of these on Amazon. Now, here's that movie I mentioned, Away from Her. It's PG-13. Like I said, Olympia Dukakis is in it. It's so good. It is loosely based on Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor had to place her husband, and she wrote a beautiful article about, she went to the facility to see her husband, and her words are, he had fallen in love with another woman. And that she said, I lost my husband to dementia and love. And she would go and she would stand at the back of the room and watch her husband be in a relationship with another woman who had dementia. And this is loosely based on that. This is the opposite. This is a man who places his wife and watches his wife start having a relationship with another man. Ironic, Sandra Day O'Connor then ended up with dementia. In fact, she's placed right now. Another movie that's on here, if you haven't seen the Glenn Campbell, I'll Be Me, it is Glenn Campbell's family with the Alzheimer's Association. They allowed a cameraman to follow them around for the last year that he was touring, and he at one point becomes hypersexual. And she discusses that, and they show it on camera where he's wanting her all the time, and he's wanting to take her and do these big romantic kisses all the time. Camera on their, no matter where they were, and she does end up, and she talks about having to use medication to help with that for a little while. There's also some websites on here. And then I want to make sure and leave a few minutes for questions. Let me stop sharing my screen. Let me see if we have anything in the chat. Let me see. In a situation when two residents become attracted to one another and then more intimately active and knowing that they have a right to be alone, how are we reassured that one is safe or not being coerced? Again, that's where you have to go to those levels of dementia. Are they on that same level? And you have to be really aware of cues. You know, I've had residents that just, I actually had a family come to me and go, at first they were very hesitant about the mom starting the relationship with this man. And by the time she had passed away, that daughter came to me and said, I think that's the happiest my mother was in her entire life, was those last 10 months when she was in the relationship with this man. And they were doing a lot of laying in the bed together. But if you even suspect that one of them is being coerced, then you do need to intervene, because we've got to make sure that there's no harm. I've had to move residents to different neighborhoods, floors, houses, wings, however you're separated, if you think that somebody's being coerced. Any other questions, comments, concerns? You will get a copy of this PowerPoint. My information is on there. Jamie's information is on there. You are free to call us, email us at any time. All right, if not, well, I appreciate you being here, and you will get an email later today with the recording, with the PowerPoints, and with the CEU information. Thank you so much for being here.